my second year presenting at the Sharing the Dream conference. And I was so glad we were able to do it via Zoom because there was no way I was making it to Southern Illinois this year. So thank you so much, Nadia, for that wonderful introduction. My name is Pamela Fullerton, and I want to start this presentation by doing a tribal land acknowledgement. It's usually how I start most of my presentations. I begin today's presentation about cultural responsiveness by acknowledging that the land that we are on is the unceded land of Indigenous people. As the educator and social justice activist Claudia Foxtree stated, the land starts and ends with Indigenous people. The land we live on in and around Chicago, Illinois, is on Potawatomi, Kickapoo, Miami, and Peoria land. Chicago is also the traditional homeland of the Council of the Three Fires, the Odawa, Ojibwe, and Potawatomi nations. The Indigenous community in Chicago is active and thriving as the 6th largest urban Indian population in the United States. I encourage all of you to increase your competency in learning about the Indigenous voices. I end this tribal land acknowledgement with the brilliant words of Foxtree. If you are not bringing Indigenous voices into the conversation, then you are not doing anti-racism, decolonizing, or fighting colonialism. You know, especially when we're talking about immigrants, right? We have to remember how important it is to understand their Indigenous ancestry, right? Just as it is important to understand the ancestry of the people that were here to begin with and are still here to this day. So what does it mean to be culturally responsive? That's kind of one of the first things that we're going to talk about, why I chose the title for this presentation. And then using those practices for serving the undocumented immigrant community. I am a licensed clinical professional counselor. I specialize in trauma and particularly trauma related to BIPOC communities. I am the owner of Advocacy and Education Consulting. I do clinical supervision, individual group counseling, community counseling, pretty much anything that the community needs, I am out there serving their needs. So I also have run a nonprofit for the last 15 years, helped to run a nonprofit for Latino youth in the Chicagoland area as well. So lot of different experiences. If you ever have questions about me and my background and my experience, feel free to, reach out to me. After the presentation, I'll put my email and information in the chat at some time. All right, so as clinicians, we're always upgrading our language that we use, right? So culturally responsive or culturally engaged, cultural humility, multiculturalism, multicultural collaboration, cultural competency. I mean, there are so many words that we have to remember, use properly, be in tune with. So I want to start by saying I chose cultural responsiveness in terms of the work that I do with the undocumented immigrant community because it embodies to me a little bit of all these words on the page right here. So it embodies the idea that we have to learn. We have to be humble about ourselves and what we know. We still have to have competency, which I think is why most of you are here today, trying to increase your competency in working with this specialized population, right? We have to understand how the different intersectionalities that come along with multiculturalism, right? Even in a population like the Latinx or Hispanic culture, we are not a monolithic culture, right? We are very heterogeneous. So we have to understand a lot about a lot, right? Or at least move in the direction of increasing our competency and our responsiveness towards all these various diverse factors of the individuals that we're working with. So why are we here? Well, the population of immigrants in the United States has been steadily increasing for the last 50 years, right? We're talking about 3 times as many immigrants as there was in the 1970s, and that number continues to increase. We also know that when we're working with immigrants, like the number one issue we have to be on the lookout for is acculturative stress. Hands down, the research has found that many immigrants experience this specific type of stress. It's specifically related to the immigrant population. And we also know that research has found a link between immigration-related trauma and mental health problems such as depression, anxiety, and post-traumatic stress disorder. Now, when we're working with students, we are the first line of defense, right? We have to see what's happening with our students. We have to understand what's happening with our students, and we have to provide them the right type of support, right? So that's what this presentation aims to do as well. So given the rising yearly number of immigrants, mental health and other professionals must learn new competencies to work effectively and compassionately with our immigrant communities. Now, a number of years ago, the American Psychological Association created a presidential task force to look into issues that they see happening with immigrants. So they found that many immigrants experience about the same amount of psychological distress as other groups. So that's not different. However, what they found was different was that this particular group experiences acculturative stressors. And so that's really what we're going to be looking at today, these specific acculturative stressors. The findings suggested that providing culturally competent mental health services to the immigrant population is the most beneficial thing that we can possibly do. So my takeaways for this presentation, which is an adapted version of a 3-hour 3CE presentation that I normally give when I present on this topic. So I'm going to maybe sound a little bit rushed or move through the information a little bit quicker than I normally would because of the time constraints of this session. But we're going to try to get through increasing our understanding, background knowledge, and skills related to clinical counseling for undocumented and immigrant populations, learning about best practices and evidence-based theories to use during counseling for undocumented and immigrant populations. I hope you'll be able to articulate some strategies that you can use to increase your cultural sensitivity when working with this population, and that you can identify some interventions that are considered best practices when working with this population. And I'm also going to give you some research and show you how to use it, how to use the resources when you're working with this population for personal, academic, and career counseling. So I want to start with the idea of many immigrants experience microaggressions and implicit bias. And this is not just out in the world, not just in society, but it's also within the counseling offices, right? So I want to make sure that we talk about this. Now, our space is completely a judgment-free zone, right? So if you have a comment that you want to make or something you want to say, just know that this is a judgment-free zone. Microaggressions are brief statements or behaviors that intentionally or not communicate a negative message about a non-dominant group. One of my favorite writers who talks about multiculturalism and then specifically microaggressions and bias is Daryl Wing Sue. And if you've never read anything by him, I highly encourage you to start reading his work. He's done many talks. He works for Columbia. No one is immune from inheriting racial, gender, and sexual orientation biases. Everyone, including marginalized group members, harbor biases and prejudice and can act in discriminatory and hurtful way towards others, right? So this is really important as clinicians because to our students, sometimes we're the only people that they can come and talk to. And if they come and try talking to us about what's going on with them, and in return, we act in some kind of way that shows bias or that's a microaggression towards the individual, we're going to turn them right off. And that's what we see is happening in our counseling offices. The research is showing that immigrants underutilize mental health services. And then when they do try to use it, they're turned off by these types of things and they don't return or they prematurely leave counseling. So we have to be very careful about how we present ourselves with the client, which again is why I call this being culturally responsive, right? So the name, Daryl Wing Sue. There we go. Okay. Because people of color, for example, don't wield power and privilege, the insults and invalidations they deliver to others are technically not considered microaggressions, but expressions of implicit bias. On an individual level, nevertheless, they are equally harmful. So, as a person of color myself, as a Latina, I harbor biases. It doesn't matter that I'm a person of color. It doesn't matter that I'm part of a minoritized population. As a human being, as a person who was born and raised in this country, I harbor biases. We all do, right? It's like this fog that we've been breathing in our entire life of living here. So we have to actively be working against this. And I also think that's why participants like yourselves came here today. And it's because you recognize that there's a huge learning curve when it comes to working with a diverse population of individuals. And part of that is learning about ourselves and how we think about them and how we work with them and how we can, be better at what we do. So I do a lot of social justice and advocacy work, and I was recently quoted in an article about that work. And I said, as long as you routinely engage in actions that will lead to social change in the spirit of diversity, equity, and inclusion, you are advocating. And if nothing else, I need you to take away from today that as a counselor, you have to be a social justice advocate for this particular population, right? This is an underserved, underrepresented population. We not only have to, do outreach and advocacy for them, but then we also have to empower this group to do it for themselves as well. So we have like a twofold job in working with this population. Ratz and Peterson has this wonderful counseling social justice model in which they focus on 3 areas of us being a counselor, being an advocate, and being a scholar, right? We should constantly be learning. We should constantly be reading. We should constantly be attending PD and conferences and things like that. This shouldn't just be a once-a-year thing. This should be something that I make my supervisees, I'm a clinical supervisor, I make them do PD every single week. It's very important for them to be reading, attending conferences, learning every week, because what's happening in these populations is happening quickly. Changes are happening quickly, and they need to be, up to date on the most recent research and information as it pertains to this population or any population that they're working with, right? And then as an advocate, there's a legislation out there for the new Mental Health Act, which would allow clinicians like myself and some of you to then take Medicare clients. That's really important. That's the type of advocacy work that we need to be doing. Or, the DREAM Act that hasn't passed in over 20 years. When that legislation comes back up, we need to be calling our Congress people. We need to be involved in the process of getting those types of legislations passed in order to best serve our clients. That's what it means to be an advocate, right? It's on a big level of laws and legislations. It's on a small level in schools. Are there certain policies or procedures that a school is doing that's not best serving our population? So for example, when I worked for a college, I had really huge issues finding money for my undocumented students. And I would go knocking on every door possible in that college to find money, and usually to no avail. But every once in a while, I would find a department who would tell me, you know what, we have some unused funds. I'm more than happy to give it to you to give to your undocumented student, right? That's what it means to be an advocate at the level of your school. And there's everything in between. So I want you to think about today, what can you put in place to be an advocate for this particular population, at all different levels. All right. So, I think that language is very important, right? And so saying the wrong thing, which we know is going to inevitably happen. I stick my foot in my mouth all the time, and then I have to recognize, oh, I said something wrong. I made an offensive remark. I'm going to have to come back and fix this. I'm going to have to be able to talk about this with my client, right? Because it's going to inevitably happen. It's most important to make sure that you do address it and that you're working on ensuring that it doesn't happen again or doesn't happen frequently, okay? So what I mean by this is understanding, first and foremost, how do the people we're working with want to be identified, right? Some people might feel comfortable or might want to identify as BIPOC, a Black, Indigenous, or person of color, right? Our largest population of immigrants, particularly in Illinois, are Hispanics, Latinos, right? How do they want to identify? You know, most of the time when I do a presentation, I'll say Latinx. I'm comfortable using that term. That's a term I choose to use when I'm talking about everybody in that community, which again is a very large, diverse community. Some other people say, no, that's offensive. We want to use Latine or Latina with the and sign, right? Other people say, no, I feel I identify as Hispanic or as a Latina, right? I told you off the bat, that's how I identify personally as a Latina. It's very important for me as a woman, you know, my womanness is a part of my identity. So that's why I say Latina. But most importantly is that you ask, you know, the student, the client, the person that you're working with, how do they want to identify? In the Latino Hispanic community, many times they identify with their country rather than with their, you know, racial ethnic minority group. So they might say, I'm Mexican American or I'm Puerto Rican or whatever they, you know, they might say. And so really important for you to ask, you know, how does this person identify? I think it's also important to understand the history because especially for immigrants, and undocumented immigrants, right? They came from another country and that was very close to them, very close to either them or their families, right? So really important to understand their history. I was working with a supervisee and, you know, she said to me like, her client was from El Salvador. She said, I wish I knew more about El Salvador. And I said, well, then go learn about it, right? If your client is talking about their country of origin, it's important to them, learn about it, right? So this really goes into the idea of being culturally responsive. It does take extra work and extra time to learn about the individuals in front of you, where they come from, how they want to be identified, you know, what was their history in coming to this country, what was their journey like in coming to this country, all those things. And of course, you know, language in general and self-naming is a very powerful tool, right? Instead of somebody telling me how I should identify, it's very empowering for me to say, no, this is how I want to be identified. And again, my favorite Daryl Wing Sue, this is one of my favorite quotes. He said, we will all commit blunders, racial, gender, sexual orientation blunders. It is not how you cover up that's important, it's how you recover. And so being able to come back and say, I made a mistake, I'm sorry, you know, could we work through this would be very important. All right, so I could spend forever talking about the therapeutic alliance because it really is that important when it comes to working, especially with minoritized populations and especially with the undocumented population. You know, their story is not for you to have off the bat. You know, you don't deserve to hear their story. You have to earn hearing their story and what happened to them. It's very personal, right? I worked as a clinical counselor for unaccompanied youth, the youth that crossed the border without parents, and those that were separated from the border. And I can tell you that it took an extremely long amount of time for me to find a way to connect with these youth, to eventually have them feel that I was somebody that they could trust, and that they could share their story with me. And when they did, I told them how extremely honored I was they chose me to share their story with, right? That's how I want us all to start thinking about working with this undocumented population, because you might find that there is, quote unquote, resistance when it comes to working with this population, like they're not sharing things with you, they're very closed. It's not resistance, it is safety, right? So I want you to definitely reframe that. It is survival for them, right? To hold on to what has happened to them. It's security. And that's a good coping mechanism to have, right? They're ensuring their safety. So in order for them to open up, we really have to establish a relationship first, establish that trust and that honesty, establish that we are willing to learn about them, that we're willing to learn about their history and their background, and that we're engaged with them in these matters. And we also have to have empathic conversations surrounding their documentation if and when they choose to share that status with us, right? I have many stories that I could share about, these times with individuals when they decided to share their documentation status. But, the most important thing that I can say is if and when somebody chooses to talk to you about this, that you ensure that, you tell them that you cannot keep everything that they say. For instance, if you find out that during their journey, they may have suffered some kind of trauma, some kind of, issue that as a mandated reporter, you may have to share or divulge, that's really important for them to know that out the gate, so that they understand that you're not trying to betray them or betray the trust of the relationship, but that as a mandated reporter, some of this information may have to come out if something had happened to that individual, right? If they decide to share their story with you. And same with the documentation status. As much as we can keep things confidential, especially when working with the schools, you may not have the ability to keep everything confidential. So it's really important not to engage in like promise keeping with them. I promise I won't, divulge anything or share, because if you break that promise, it's going to really hurt the therapeutic alliance, right? Instead, being more open and honest with them about the process, so that they know that there may be a possibility of some of this information needing to be shared, I think is way more important. All right, so we're not going to watch this video for time's sake, but Roberto Gonzalez is like the foremost expert in working with undocumented students. And if you've never heard him speak, you can find him on YouTube, and he's a professor at Harvard. He talks all the time, but his book, which I highly suggest, is called Lives in Limbo. You really want to learn about, the biggest research that has been done on undocumented student populations. It is with this man, Roberto Gonzalez. All right. So I told you I want to make sure you leave with some background information about this particular population. Really important to understand documentation status and how it leaves our students in different, what we call liminality, okay? Liminality. So that means that they have different understandings of and making meanings of their life based on their documentation status. So somebody who has a DACA status, right? Somebody who received deferred action for childhood arrival status is different than somebody who is undocumented, is different than somebody who has some kind of a refugee or asylum status or other kind of status, right? Really important to understand how their status impacts them as an individual. I also want you to, when you're working with a student, and if you can, and if they allow you, to gather as much information, pre, post migration in their experience. Understand how their family plays a system. Many of these immigrant students come from collectivist cultures, which means that, their family, their culture, their society plays a big role in their life, right? So even if you're working individually with a client, that family systems plays a role in what you're doing. So, having that be a part of it. Understanding and being knowledgeable about career development to empower these clients. I'm going to talk about how career counseling is a social justice issue with this population. And so we need to ensure that we are knowledgeable about how we can help them navigate career systems in this country with their different statuses. The ILRC is a wonderful website to learn more about each of the different documentation statuses and how they impact individuals in this country. You can see the website at the bottom of my screen, www.ilrc.org. They have a whole section that they update regularly on documentation status. And how it plays a role in our society. All right, so here's what the research is saying. A culture of stress is unique to the immigrant experience. So when we're talking with undocumented immigrants, we have to start being aware of what level of a culture of stress may be going on with these individuals. We know that Latinos, US born and immigrant, right, which means foreign born, experience higher rates of depression than any other ethnic racial group. And I'm going to talk about specifically what that means for this group in a minute. And evidence suggests that immigrants underuse mental health services, right? So how are we knowing that information, what are we going to do in order to change that curve of immigrants underusing mental health services when we know that they have high rates of acculturative stress, especially with our largest immigrant population of Latinos, that they have the highest rates of depression than any other racial ethnic group? What are we going to do to ensure that we're getting them access and use to mental health services? So Forrester and company did a really great study on immigrant Hispanic youth, and they found that there is a connection between bicultural stress and the context of reception. All right, context of reception means how are they received in their society? How are they received in their society? If you can imagine, and you can just think about the socio-political climate in these last few years towards Hispanics and Latinos, the context of reception has not been very good, right? And so what Forrester found is that when there is negative context of reception, there is increased bicultural stress. And how these individuals are emoting, even though they're experiencing symptoms like depression and anxiety, instead of withdrawing, which is what we typically see with people experiencing depression, is withdrawal and isolation. What we're seeing instead for this particular group of immigrants, we're seeing increased levels of aggression and rule-breaking behaviors. So what I mean by cultural responsiveness is understanding that even though I may took a PD on depression, and the signs of depression are withdrawal from activities, withdrawal from friends, staying at home, being isolated, I have to understand that there's a possibility that for my Hispanic immigrant youth, I might instead see levels of aggression or rule-breaking behaviors. And know that underneath that is really anxiety, stress, and depression. That's where advocacy comes in. Why is it that our Latino males have higher rates of dropout in schools, higher rates of suspensions and expulsions and things like that? It's because we're just looking at their behaviors on the surface level instead of working with what's underneath. We also know that as a culture of stress increases, so do internalizing mental health symptoms. So depression, anxiety, somatic symptoms, like I just talked about, right? We also know that with immigrants, that gender and their immigration generation may also play a role in internalizing and externalizing behaviors. For example, we are seeing that like second generation Latina girls have higher rates of suicidal behaviors when there's family conflict. And we're seeing a lot of that playing out, right? So in that case, second generation Latinas and their gender, their girls, have increasing their rates of suicidality. So we also have to be paying attention to how gender may play a role, how immigration generation may play a role in what's happening with our students. There is also something called the immigrant paradox, right? Where the longer immigrants reside in the US, the more mental health issues they in fact have. So we see less mental health issues right off the bat when an immigrant first moves to the United States. The longer they are in the United States, we're seeing increased mental health issues. That's what the paradox is, and it's a big issue, right? We also know that immigrants are extremely heterogeneous. So I want you to think of the Latinx community. There are over 20, Latin American countries. Not even all of them are Spanish speaking, right? Brazil is technically considered a Latin American country, but they speak Portuguese, right? I worked with Guatemalan clients who speak Quiche, which is an indigenous language. I had to use an interpreter, right? Because they didn't speak Spanish and I didn't speak their indigenous language. So really important to understand, all the factors of culture, religion, language, all the factors and how they're playing a role in the individual. If you're looking for a really great acculturative stress measure, I want you to look into the SAFE short. And the SAFE stands for Societal, Attitudinal, Familiar, and Environmental Form. And this is for immigrants, adolescents. Really great acculturative stress measure. Give you a good idea of what may be occurring with the individual. I also want you to be looking into how you can capture community cultural wealth. And I'm going to give you an example of what that looks like. And it's really, really important for immigrants to find ways to connect with their ethnic identity. So connecting with their ethnic identity, research has found decreases acculturative stressors, decreases mental health issues. Those that are disconnected from their ethnic identity, research has found the opposite, that it in fact becomes a risk factor. And we see immigrants who disconnected from their ethnic identity are more likely to have mental health issues, including depression, anxiety, and those somatic symptoms. And one great tool that research has found to be used well with undocumented immigrants specifically has been narrative therapy. As I talked about the power of language at the beginning, right, being able to self-identify, self-name, that's very empowering. What narrative therapy does is it allows somebody to reauthor their story. So instead of somebody telling me my story and who I am and what I am in this country, I get to reauthor my narrative and talk about, who I want to be, who I feel that I am, how I identify, and how my story is empowering to me. So this is one example of cultural capital, and this is for Latinx individuals particularly. So what you want to be on the lookout for are these things, right? What are their aspirations? What are their linguistic talents? What kind of social capital do they have? Social networking, making friends, forming relationships. What is their, navigational specialization? So Do they understand how to navigate certain spaces? You know, remember, there are certain people born in this country with privilege and having things like you already have a network, you already have a, you know, big social group. These individuals don't necessarily, or may not necessarily start with all those things, or maybe they had it in their country of origin. Now this is a new country, right? So we have to collect information on these areas about them, see what they have, and see how we can fill in the blanks in the other areas that may be low or missing, right? And I also want to recognize, you know, the last one, which is their spirituality or their faith. You know, this is extremely important. I know this is something that many counselors shy away from, especially if you're working in a school. You know, we're not supposed to be talking about that kind of thing. But for many individuals, their spirituality and their faith are extremely important to them. We cannot leave that part out, right? So really important to gather all this cultural collective wealth about these individuals and see how it can be used to serve them, to, you know, to help them reach their potential, to help them grow during their time that they're with you. And, you know, this is, you know, unique to the Latinx culture, right, according to this research, but it can be, you know, used with other cultures as well, where you can find information about cultural wealth for other cultures if you're working with, let's say, an undocumented immigrant from India or Poland, which are other countries and that we have a lot of immigrants from, especially in Illinois. All right, so there are over 46 million immigrants, or at least who identify as immigrant, in the United States. Of those 46 plus million, over 1.8 million live in Illinois. And there are roughly 400,000+ undocumented immigrants in Illinois, predominantly the Chicagoland area. Now, these numbers are all floors. They're definitely not ceilings, because there are many individuals who choose not to identify, again, for their reasons. Maybe it's safety, but just know that there's probably a whole lot more than this, right? But we are living in a state that has the top five number and amount of immigrants and undocumented immigrants in the whole of the United States. So we have to be competent, because we know somewhere along the line we're going to be working with this community. So really important to understand laws that have been enacted or that are still, you know, waiting to be enacted, and how they impact our students. So, you know, starting in 1982, Plyler versus Doe, that's when undocumented immigrants were allowed to go to school and get free K-12 education. That really wasn't that long ago. So that just tells you how, you know, it's been a fight in this country to support undocumented immigrants, and it will continue to be a fight. And we have to make sure that we're on the front lines doing what we need to do. We have to understand that many of our undocumented immigrants come with double, sometimes triple or more minority status. So what does that mean? Well, if they're a person of color, if they're from a racial ethnic minority population, there's a minority status. The fact that they're non-native English speakers, that's a minority status. We know that for up to 40% or even more of immigrants live in poverty. That's a minority status. Now, add undocumented to that, and it's upwards of 60% of undocumented individuals live in poverty, right? That's a minority status. So, and let's just say somebody has a disability. That's a minority status, right? We have to understand how each of their intersectionalities play a role in what's going on with them, because we may need to provide services for all those different areas. We know the DREAM Act, which would allow a pathway to citizenship for many undocumented individuals, that has yet to be passed, right? So there's a way that we could be advocates in figuring out, you know, after 20+ years, how we can get that finally passed. We know DACA was passed in 2012, but hey, depending on the socio-political climate, that tried to be ended during the last presidency. So it's not like somebody who has DACA status feels safe. They don't, right? They're still in a liminal status as well, because they don't know what's going to happen in the next turn. Are they going to get their status back again? What's going to happen next, right? And then all these other acts, for example, it took until this new presidency in order for some of that CARES money from the pandemic to go to students that are undocumented in schools. And we have like the HB 3438, that's the House bill that was passed in 2021, that ensures that by 2023, colleges have to have an undocumented liaison. Now, are they giving money for that person? No, the school has to kind of figure that out. What are the requirements of that person? That's not either in the bill. It just says they have to have somebody, right? So again, what is your school doing about that? Who's going to be their person? What's the competency level of that person? What's the background of that person? How many people are going to be hired in that department to serve an entire population of undocumented students? That kind of a thing, right? That's another way for us to be advocates, is seeing these different laws and seeing how they're being played out in our schools or in our communities to ensure that our students are getting what they deserve and what they need. I want to make sure I have enough time for the rest of the presentation, so I'm going to move a little bit quicker here. All right, so if you're looking for specific strategies to clinical supports for these individuals, I'm going to give you a couple right now. So the first one is called the addressing model. And what I love about the addressing model is that it is a trauma-informed model as well. And we have to understand that many undocumented immigrants have experienced some kind of trauma. I mean, if they've been here through the pandemic, I'm pretty sure we can almost classify that as being traumatic for many individuals in the United States and abroad. So somewhere along the line, being trauma-informed is beneficial, period. And so what the addressing model takes into account is age, disability, religion and spirituality, ethnic identity, socioeconomic status, sexual orientation, indigenous heritage, national origin, and gender identity. So you would use all of these factors in order to really get to understand your client, your student that you're working with, areas that may be giving them stress, areas that may be, causing some kind of conflict for them, and also, more importantly, areas of strength. So where are there areas of strength within this individual that we can pull from in order to empower them, and again, help them grow and reach their potential in all the other areas. The Abcde assessment model by Collins and Collins is another really great model to use when working with undocumented immigrant clients. So this is, you would be looking at the client's affect, what's given the issues that are happening with this particular client, what feelings might they be experiencing? So really getting to, and remembering that we talked about how various populations emote differently. So, their expression, expression of feelings may look different than another population. So understanding what you think that their feelings may be. Looking at their behavior, what actions are the client taking to deal with their inciting stressors. Remember the Forrester research talked about when Hispanic immigrant youth were experiencing depression and stressors, they didn't withdraw. Instead, they showed aggressive behaviors, right? And delinquent type behaviors. So really important to understand that. The C stands for cognition. So this is really getting into the mindset of the client. What does the client think is happening to them? What do they think is going on with them, right? How do they explain it? I had a Hispanic boy client once who was really having hallucinations, but it took us a while to figure it out because he kept having a religious explanation. to talk about why he was doing the things and thinking the things he was thinking. And it wasn't until we figured out that he was having, hallucinations that we were able to provide him with the support. But it was interesting to get his explanation of what he thought was happening to him that helped me to eventually get to the point of giving him that type of help that he needed. D stands for development. So really important to understand the current developmental stage of the client, right? Given their age and what's happened to them. Are they kind of right on track with the rest of their peers developmentally, or does something else happen that may have disrupted that natural development? Using Erickson has found to be really good even for immigrant youth. And then particularly for immigrant population, recognizing their whole ecosystem. Again, many immigrants come from collectivist cultures, which means it's not just them. They're not just living in a bubble. They're part of this larger community. So we have to be able to reach out to that community and see what resources the community can support these individuals. Another really great resource to use is the multi-level modal of psychotherapy, which was created by Chung and company. And so multi-level, there are 5 levels that we're going to talk about. So you as a clinician, these are the things you need to ensure that you're doing when you're working with undocumented immigrant populations. So the first thing is mental health education. So last night I was on a panel, Latinx Talks, and we were talking about how the Latinx community underutilizes mental health services. And they asked, well, what's the first thing we need to do to kind of like reverse that trend? We need to offer mental health education. We need to talk about what is mental health? What does it look like? We all have it, right? What does it mean to be aware of our mental health? So that's familiarizing our clients with the idea of mental health. Culturally, it may not be something that these individuals talk about in their country. I have a partner I work with in Mexico. She's a clinical counselor like myself, but they don't even have the word counselor. So everybody is a psychologist, right? They just call everybody psicóloga down there. So again, talking about these differences that we have here in the United States, talking about the different type of mental health services that we provide and that we have, that's really important, like kind of spreading that psychoeducation, that baseline foundation. Level 2, you're working with not only the individual, but group and family counseling interventions. Remember, we're working with collectivist cultures most of the time. So we're also looking at like traditional counseling, but we're also looking at like indigenous ways of healing as well. And making sure that our counseling techniques that we're using are respectful and sensitive to our immigrant clients. Level 3 is cultural empowerment. Again, remember what the research told us, that when our immigrant clients are connected to their culture, we see decreased levels of acculturative stress. And then the opposite occurs, and it becomes a risk factor when they're disconnected from their racial ethnic identity. So we have to make sure that we're using tools and interventions that culturally empower our clients. Level 4 is that integration of Western and traditional healing practices. You may need to go out to the community and find, what are those traditional healing practices that you may be able to integrate in your practice with a student or client. And then level 5 is addressing social justice and human rights issues. And I've been talking about that from the beginning. And I asked you to think about how can you begin to be a social justice advocate for these clients? And it looks like many different things. All right, another really great study. I really, really want you to think about this, by Rogers, Searin and company. So they asked undocumented and immigrant clients, tell us about your experience in working with clinicians. And from this study, here's what they were able to gather. A competent counselor, a culturally competent counselor does these things. They're open to learning about the client's culture. They use culture in an appropriate way, which means they're not pathologizing culture. They know when culture is not related to an issue. They demonstrate patience, right? Because this is new for many of our clients, and they display empathy. A culturally incompetent counselor looks the opposite. They lack clarity about what therapy entails, right? So there's not that foundation, that psychoeducation laid. The client experiences discrimination and microaggressions, both direct and indirect. The counselor assumes that they have adequate knowledge about the culture in which the person they're working with identifies. And they pathologize cultural differences, right? So something in their culture has to be wrong, and that's why the person's acting the way that they're acting, right? So when we're working, if you are working in a capacity where you have to diagnose a client, I want you to keep in mind that it's really important to be least pathological and least restrictive when it comes to these diagnoses. All right. I believe career counseling is a social justice advocacy issue. Remember what I told you, 40 or more % of immigrants live in poverty. And that number goes even exponentially higher if they're undocumented. That's an economic social justice issue. How do we provide, economic wealth back into these communities is to help them get careers and jobs that are higher paying, that can support them in increasing their wealth and getting out of poverty. These three systems tended to show best practice when working with immigrant and undocumented immigrant clients. SUPR's career counseling theory, systems theory framework, and social cognitive career theory. Really important to keep additional lenses of person-centered, trauma-informed, and even relational cultural theory, right? Which puts relationships at the center when working with these clients. Understand their identity development, find ways to empower them. Yes, be realistic about barriers and limitations. There is a difference in being able to get a certain type of career or job when somebody has an undocumented status versus when somebody has a DACA status versus when somebody has a refugee asylum or straight out, a citizenship status. So really important that they understand that you understand that, and see how that plays a role in their career aspirations. I really, really despise when people just hand students a list of resources. Please don't do that. Remember, we talked about navigation as a cultural wealth piece. Not every student knows how to navigate. So we can't just hand them a list and say, here's a list of 50 scholarships, go look. Here's a list of jobs you can do, go look. No, we have to do this with them. And I encourage all of you to be collaborative partners with these individuals, right? Help them gain these skills, empower them with these skills. So I see research as a two-way street when working with undocumented individuals, right? For DACA, if they have DACA status, it's like we're going to talk about their work authorization card. We're going to talk about what that allows them to do. We're going to talk about how they could possibly start a business. We're going to talk about how they have to maintain or renew their DACA status. We're going to talk about companies that signed the pro-DACA amicus brief. They signed that when the Trump administration was trying to take away DACA. These organizations went to the Supreme Court to stop that from happening and signed a document saying they are organizations that want to hire and that need immigrants, including DACA recipients. We know that those are DACA-friendly companies. Those might be good companies to work for, right? We're going to help them research these companies and see if on their website they talk about wanting to hire immigrants, wanting to hire DACA, recipients and whatnot. And we're also going to talk about, do we disclose or not as a DACA recipient? They don't have to, right? And so what are the pros and cons? And we're going to help them look into that and decide what they want to do. Maybe we role play if they decide they want to have that conversation, or maybe we role play if, somebody tries to throw that question at them and they don't want to answer it, how can they answer it in a way that doesn't, give away what their status is? What happens to an individual that's undocumented? That's very different, right? Different career and legal income options, but there's still a lot. I was working with a student who was failing, like pretty much failing their accounting classes. And I'm like, what's going on? I thought, isn't this what you want to go into? And she's like, no, somebody told me to go into accounting because I'm undocumented and I can be an accountant and be undocumented. And I was like, that's not a reason to take a career, right? This student now is going into a completely different career pathway because I was able to work with her and show her her various options. That's what I mean by career counseling being a social justice advocacy issue, right? So you have to know all the various options and legal income options that undocumented students can pursue. And that includes like helping professions in the state of Illinois. There was a law that was passed that they don't need they don't need documentation status to get a license through the IDFPR, right? So they have the option to do some helping professions. All right, I've got like research up the wazoo about whatever you possibly could want to know about. So if you, have something specific or you're looking for something specific, and, if I can't find it for you, I will, hand you off to somebody else who might, but just let me know. Research is a big part of I think being a social justice advocate too for these individuals. You might have to put in that extra work like I talked about. My final thought is this: we got to move outside the traditional counseling setting and role to best support these individuals. And I spent the last 50 or so minutes telling you how we got to really work outside those traditional models. So here is information about me. You can reach out to me via my website, aeconsulting.com, or my email, pfullerton@aeconsulting.com. Whew, I made it, Nadia.
Pamela, all I have to say is, wow, fantastic. And where have you been all of my life? Ladies and gentlemen, this is a recording. This will be posted on the IACAC website. Share it with your community, share it with your deans, share it with your school administration, share it with anyone who is working with students, specifically those that are undocumented. But I was able to just see so many different areas where this can be a major impact for the well-being of our communities, right? Our adults, our students, our young children, our older children. So this is just, I mean, you gave me goosebumps so many times. And when you start your podcast, please let me know so I can follow you, because this was powerful. So if there are any questions in the chat, or if anybody would like to get off mic, this is your time. We have 1 more minute. I'm just looking through to see if there's any questions.
Yeah, any questions? Yeah, so I was a panelist yesterday on Latinx Talks. I think it should be posted. We did live, Facebook Live and Instagram Live. I just started social media. It's like, I'm 40. I didn't have a cell phone growing up. I know nothing about social media, but everybody was like, Pam, you gotta get on social media. Fine. So I started it, and I'm putting things out there. I do this presentation. Like I said, I am a CE sponsor for the state of Illinois. So I do this presentation like for the Jocelyn Center, or I have one upcoming for Chicago Mines in November, I think, where you'd be able to then receive CEs. And my presentation is a lot longer. Obviously, this is a very condensed version of everything, but let me know how I can best serve you. I go to schools, I go to communities, I do what I can to promote mental health awareness, best practices for BIPOC, undocumented, and immigrant communities.
Well, thank you very much. I think we are so lucky to have you in our world. So if anyone just forgets, we have a recording of this. It will be on the IACIC website in case there's anything that you missed out on during the presentation. Or if you want to share this with anyone and everyone in your community, please do. Enjoy the rest of your 15 minutes. And don't forget, at 2:15, we'll start our next presentation. Pamela, thank you once again.
Thank you, Nadia. Bye, everyone.
Thank you. This was great.
Thank you.